There's a church ledger in a small town in Montana that contains an entry nobody wants to talk about, written in careful script dated July 14th, 1879. The handwriting belongs to Father Patrick Dougherty, the parish priest at St. Mary's Catholic Church. The entry is brief, matter-of-fact in tone, but what it describes shouldn't be possible according to everything we're told about human history. Last rites administered. Male. Approximate age unknown. Height 9 feet 4 inches. Cause of death. Natural causes. Buried outside consecrated ground per diocesan instruction. 9 feet 4 inches. The ledger specifies it twice, once in the entry itself, and again in the margin where someone, presumably Father Dougherty, added a note. Measured 3 times to ensure accuracy. Witnessed by 5 members of the congregation. The body was too large for standard burial. A grave was dug in unconsecrated ground behind the church property. No name is given. Just male, giant stature, died in the care of the church. Father Dougherty performed the last rites. This is documented, this is in an official church record, and then the entry stops. No follow-up, no explanation of who this person was or where he came from. The ledger still exists. It's kept in the diocesan archives in Helena, Montana. Researchers who've examined it confirm the entry is authentic. The paper, the ink, the handwriting, all consistent with other entries from the same period. This wasn't added later. This wasn't a forgery. In 1879, a Catholic priest in Montana administered last rites to someone nearly 9.5 feet tall and recorded it in the official church ledger. The question is why this doesn't appear in any history of the period, why there's no newspaper coverage, why the body wasn't examined by medical authorities, why it was buried in unconsecrated ground and forgotten. Start with what we know about giants in official records. They're everywhere, if you look, not in mainstream histories, but in church records, burial registries, county documents, newspaper archives from the 1800s, accounts of skeletons found measuring 7, 8, 9 feet, sometimes larger. These aren't scattered anomalies. They're consistent patterns across regions and time periods. The Smithsonian received thousands of reports of giant skeletons found in burial mounds across the Midwest in the late 1800s. Almost none made it into official archaeological records. Father Dougherty's entry is unusual because it documents a giant who died in the church's care, not a skeleton found in the ground. This was a living person, someone the priest spoke to, someone who received sacraments, someone whose height was measured multiple times because even the priest couldn't believe what he was seeing. The entry mentions witnesses. 5 members of the congregation saw this person, confirmed the measurements, watched the burial. These weren't anonymous claims, these were named members of a community who vouched for what happened. The note about burial outside consecrated ground is significant. Catholic doctrine is specific about burial rites. Consecrated ground is for baptized Catholics who died in communion with the Church. Burial outside consecrated ground is reserved for specific cases. Unbaptized individuals, those who died in mortal sin, those whose status within the Church was unclear. The fact that Father Dougherty performed last rites suggests he considered this person Catholic or at least eligible for sacraments. But the burial location suggests diocesan authorities made a different determination. Someone gave instructions to bury the body outside the main cemetery. Someone wanted this kept separate. Consider the timing. 1879. Montana was barely established as a territory. The area around St. Mary's was frontier, small population, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. A person 9 feet 4 inches tall would have been known to the entire community. There would have been stories, legends. Everyone would have remembered the giant who died at the church, yet there's no local oral history, no family stories passed down, nothing except the ledger entry. It's as if the entire community agreed to forget this happened. There's a pattern here that appears in other cases. When giants are found or documented, there's initial attention followed by deliberate suppression. Newspapers might run a story, local authorities might take measurements, photographs might even be taken. Then everything disappears, records vanish, photographs are lost, newspaper archives have missing pages from exactly those dates. Bodies are confiscated by federal authorities or academic institutions and never seen again. What happened in Montana fits this pattern. An event occurred, it was documented, then it was buried literally and figuratively. The Tartaria theory provides context. The idea that a previous civilization existed was deliberately erased from history, and that evidence of this civilization keeps appearing in forms that official narratives can't explain. Giants are part of this evidence, not mythological giants from folklore. Real people of exceptional height who were part of populations that mainstream archaeology doesn't acknowledge. The church ledger in Montana isn't an isolated oddity. It's one piece of a much larger pattern of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. There were people in North America in the 1800s who didn't fit the accepted historical narrative, and someone made sure they disappeared from that narrative. Father Dougherty's entry mentions that the individual died of natural causes. No violence, no accident, just death from age or illness. This suggests the person lived in the area for some time before dying. Wasn't a traveller passing through, was part of the community in some capacity. Yet no other records mention this person's presence. No census data, no property records, no mentions in correspondence or diaries from the period. A person nearly 9.5 feet tall lived in a small Montana town long enough to die there naturally, and nobody documented anything about them except the priest who performed the final sacraments. The diocesan instruction to bury outside consecrated ground is the critical detail. This wasn't the priest's decision. Someone higher in the church hierarchy gave orders. Why? If this was simply an unusually tall person, there would be no theological reason to deny normal burial. The church has buried people of all physical conditions in consecrated ground throughout history. The decision to exclude this burial suggests something else was at play. Perhaps concerns about how the community would react. Perhaps concerns about what questions the burial might raise. Perhaps instructions from authorities outside the church entirely. There's evidence that in the late 1800s, federal authorities were actively involved in suppressing information about archaeological finds that contradicted official histories. The Smithsonian Institution received numerous reports of giant skeletons from burial mounds. They sent teams to excavate. They collected specimens. Then the specimens disappeared. Modern inquiries to the Smithsonian about these collections receive vague responses about records being lost or incomplete. The pattern suggests intentional suppression rather than simple record-keeping failures. Montana in 1879 was under federal territorial administration. The church operated with federal oversight. If federal authorities wanted something kept quiet, they had mechanisms to ensure compliance. A directive from territorial administrators to church authorities would explain why the burial happened outside consecrated ground, would explain why no follow-up documentation exists, would explain why the community apparently forgot an event that should have been unforgettable. The measurement detail matters. 9 feet 4 inches, measured 3 times. Father Dougherty wasn't guessing. He used tools, probably a measuring rope or chain. Did it multiple times to confirm because he knew how extraordinary the claim was. Had witnesses verify. This is someone being methodical because they understand they're documenting something that will be questioned. The fact that he went to this effort suggests he expected the record to be examined, expected scrutiny, wanted to establish beyond doubt that what he recorded was accurate. What happened to the burial site? Church records from later years make no mention of it. When St. Mary's Cemetery was expanded in the early 1900s, no record indicates whether the grave was disturbed or moved. Local histories of the area don't mention unusual graves or relocated remains. It's possible the grave is still there, unmarked, on land that's no longer church property. Or it's possible the remains were exhumed at some point and disappeared the same way other giant skeletons disappeared into federal custody. There are other cases similar to this one. A church record from Pennsylvania dated 1862 documents baptism and last rites for an individual 8 feet 7 inches tall. A cemetery record from Ohio dated 1875 lists a burial for someone 9 feet 1 inch. A hospital record from New York dated 1883 mentions a patient of giant stature who died shortly after admission. These are official records created by institutions with no reason to fabricate. yet none appear in medical literature or historical accounts. The suppression pattern is consistent. Official documentation exists proving these cases happened, but the documentation is isolated. No follow-up investigation, no scientific examination, no public discourse, just brief records confirming something extraordinary occurred. Then silence. It's the silence that's most telling. In an era when medical oddities were displayed in museums, when newspapers reported extensively on unusual events, giants were documented and then deliberately ignored. Father Dougherty himself left no other mention of this event. His personal papers, preserved in the diocesan archives, contain journals and correspondence covering his years in Montana. The entries around July 1879 discuss routine parish matters: baptisms, marriages, Sunday attendance, repairs to the church building. No mention of administering last rites to a giant. No mention of the extraordinary burial. No letters to superiors asking for guidance. It's as if he documented the event in the official ledger because he had to, then never spoke of it again. This suggests he was told not to speak of it. Someone with authority over him gave instructions: record the death and burial as required by church law, then say nothing more. Don't discuss it in correspondence, don't mention it in journals, don't tell the story. The fact that he obeyed so completely suggests the instructions came with weight, perhaps threats to his position, perhaps appeals to loyalty, perhaps explanations that convinced him silence was necessary for reasons he couldn't question. The 5 witnesses mentioned in the ledger can't be identified. The entry doesn't name them. Church records from the period list congregation members, but there's no indication which 5 were present at the burial. This is unusual. When witnesses are mentioned in official church records, they're typically named. The fact these witnesses are mentioned but not identified suggests their anonymity was intentional. Protect those who saw. Make sure they can't be questioned later. What does this tell us about historical suppression? That it happens at multiple levels simultaneously. Federal authorities suppress evidence through confiscation and institutional control. Religious institutions suppress through selective record-keeping and instructed silence. Local communities suppress through collective forgetting and oral tradition, failure. The result is that events which should be documented extensively in multiple sources appear only as fragmentary references that can be dismissed as anomalies or errors. The Tartaria framework explains why this suppression would be necessary. If a previous advanced civilization existed and was deliberately written out of history, then evidence of unusual populations from that civilization would need to be suppressed as well. Giants aren't supernatural. They're biological. If populations of unusually tall people existed in North America in the 1800s, they would be remnants of earlier populations. Their existence would raise questions about where they came from. Questions that would lead to examining the official narrative of American settlement and prehistory. Questions that would reveal the narrative is incomplete or false. Father Dougherty's ledger entry is important because it can't be easily dismissed. It's not a newspaper story that might be sensationalized. It's not a verbal account that might be exaggerated. It's an official church record created for administrative and sacramental purposes. The priest had no incentive to falsify. The church had no incentive to include false information in official ledgers. The entry exists because something happened that required documentation. Someone 9 feet 4 inches tall died. A priest performed last rites. The body was buried. These are facts recorded in a source designed to preserve facts. The question becomes what we do with information like this. Accept that official histories are incomplete. Consider that populations existed in recent history that we're not told about. Examine other fragmentary records with the understanding that patterns of suppression explain why the records are fragmentary. The Montana ledger entry isn't proof of Tartaria by itself, but it's evidence that something in the accepted historical narrative is wrong, that people who shouldn't exist according to mainstream history did exist, that their existence was documented, and that this documentation was suppressed or ignored to maintain a historical narrative that couldn't accommodate their presence. Father Dougherty died in 1903. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his decades of service to the church, called him a beloved member of the community, made no mention of anything unusual in his career. The ledger entry from 1879 remained in the archives, unexamined and unremarked upon, until researchers looking specifically for this type of evidence found it decades later. It was there the entire time, in an official church record, accessible to anyone who looked. But nobody looked because nobody thought to question whether giants had been real, documented, and then erased from history. The evidence was hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right questions.